It is an hour before sunrise on a cold morning in the year 1300, somewhere in the English Midlands. Inside a small house made of timber, mud, and straw, a family of 6 is already awake. There is no clock in the village. There is no clock in the entire county. But the rooster has called, the fire needs feeding, and the animals sleeping at the other end of the house are stirring. For the people of this village, the day has begun, and it will not end until darkness makes work impossible. We often imagine medieval villagers as figures in the background of history, bent over fields, living lives of endless, identical drudgery. But the surviving records tell a far more interesting story. Manorial court rolls, tax assessments, coroner's reports, and the account books of medieval estates reveal daily lives that were structured, varied, social, and surprisingly complex. So what did medieval villagers actually do all day? The answer depends on the season, the person, and the hour. And by the end of this journey, you will understand a working day that modern life has almost completely forgotten. Before we step into that morning, if you find yourself fascinated by how ordinary people actually lived throughout history, consider subscribing to Every Life Explained, because this channel exists to answer exactly these kinds of questions, one era at a time. To understand a villager's day, you first have to understand the world that shaped it. In the England of the High Middle Ages, roughly 9 out of every 10 people lived in the countryside. Historians estimate that around the year 1300, England held between 4 and 6 million people, and the overwhelming majority of them were peasants, a broad category that included serfs bound to a lord's land, and free tenants who paid rent but could come and go. Most lived in villages of a few dozen to a few hundred inhabitants, clustered around a church, a manor house, and open fields that stretched to the horizon. The village was not simply a place where people happened to live. It was an economic machine, a legal community, and a survival system all at once. In much of England and Northern Europe, the land was organized under what historians call the open field system. Instead of each family farming one consolidated plot, the village's arable land was divided into 2 or 3 enormous fields, and each family held long, narrow strips scattered across all of them. A typical strip was about an acre or half an acre. The amount a plow team could reasonably turn in a day, which is where the word acre comes from in the first place. This scattering was not chaos, it was insurance. Good soil and bad soil, wet ground and dry ground, were shared among households so that no single family monopolized the best land or was ruined by the worst. But it also meant that farming was never a private activity. Plowing, planting, and harvesting had to be coordinated with neighbors because your strip sat beside theirs, and the village's plow teams, often 8 oxen strong, were assembled from animals owned by several different families. Almost no peasant household owned a full team alone. Cooperation was not a virtue in the medieval village. It was a requirement for eating. Above the villagers stood the lord of the manor, and this relationship defined the rhythm of many lives. A serf, called a villain in England, typically held his house and strips of land in exchange for labor on the lord's own land, known as the demesne. Manorial surveys from the 13th century record these obligations precisely, often 2 or 3 days of work per week on the lord's fields, plus extra days called boon works at plowing time and harvest, when every able hand in the village might be summoned. Records from English manors show that lords sometimes provided food on these boon days, bread, ale, occasionally meat or herring. and the quality of that meal was itself a subject of negotiation and complaint, carefully written down by manorial clerks. So when we ask what a villager did all day, we are really asking about two overlapping working lives: the work a family did to feed itself, and the work it owed to someone else. Now, let us return to that dark morning in 1300 and follow a single household through its day, not a named individual, because the ordinary people of this era rarely left personal records, but a composite drawn from what historians such as Barbara Hannawalt, Christopher Dyer, and H.S. Bennett have reconstructed from thousands of documents. The house itself would surprise a modern visitor. A typical peasant home was a single open structure, perhaps 15 feet wide and 30 to 50 feet long, built of a timber frame filled with wattle and daub. Woven branches plastered with a mixture of clay, straw, and dung. The roof was thatch. The floor was packed earth, sometimes strewn with rushes. In many homes, especially the longhouse style common in parts of Britain, the family lived at one end, and the animals were stabled at the other, separated by little more than a partition. This was not carelessness. Animals were the family's most valuable property, vulnerable to theft and cold, and their body heat warmed the house through winter nights. There was no chimney. Smoke from the central hearth drifted up through the thatch, or a simple vent, which is why excavated medieval skeletons and later medical observations suggest that respiratory problems were a constant companion of indoor life. Light came from the fire, from rushlights, rushes dipped in animal fat, and, for those who could afford them, tallow candles. Because artificial light was expensive and dim, the working day was ruled absolutely by the sun. In June, that could mean 16 hours of usable daylight. In December, barely 8. The first tasks of the morning belonged to the whole family, divided by long custom. The wife or an older daughter revived the fire, which had been banked overnight under a cover. The curfew, from the French couvre-feu, cover the fire, a word that survives in our language today. Water had to be fetched from the village well or a stream, often several trips with heavy wooden buckets or clay jugs. The animals had to be fed and watered, the cow milked if the family was fortunate enough to own one. The hens checked for eggs. Breakfast, if it deserved the name, was brief and modest. Most evidence suggests villagers ate a piece of bread, perhaps with ale, before heading out. And this bread deserves a moment of attention because it was the absolute center of the medieval diet. Historians of the medieval economy estimate that grain products supplied the majority of a peasant family's calories, in many reconstructions well over half, and in poorer households closer to 3/4. The bread of the countryside was rarely the white wheat loaf of the wealthy. It was maslin, a mix of wheat and rye, or barley bread, or in hard years, bread stretched with beans and peas ground into the flour. Dark, dense, and filling. With the light rising, the day's main work began, and here everything depended on the season. Because the medieval year was not a repeating loop of identical days, but a great wheel of distinct tasks, each with its own urgency. In the autumn, roughly from Michaelmas at the end of September, the critical work was plowing and sowing the winter grain, wheat and rye. Plowing was the defining labor of the medieval countryside, so much so that the plowman became the symbol of the honest working life in medieval literature, most famously in William Langland's 14th century poem, Piers Plowman. A man guided the heavy plow while another, often a boy, walked beside the oxen with a goad, keeping the team moving. The pace was slow. Oxen walk at about 2 miles per hour, and the standard expectation recorded in estate management treatises like the 13th century Walter of Henley's Husbandry, was that a team should plow roughly an acre a day. Behind the plow came the sower, walking the furrows with a seed basket, broadcasting grain by hand with a practiced rhythm, followed by harrowing to cover the seed before the birds took it. In winter, from roughly November to February, the fields demanded less, but the days were short and the work did not stop. This was the season for threshing, beating the harvested grain with flails on the barn floor to separate the kernels from the straw, then winnowing, tossing the grain so the wind carried away the chaff. It was monotonous, dusty, indoor work, and it could occupy weeks. Winter was also the time for repairing tools, mending fences and hedges, ditching to drain the fields, cutting and hauling firewood, and slaughtering animals that could not be fed through the cold months. The November pig slaughter was so universal that medieval calendar illustrations, the famous labors of the months, carved into churches and painted into books of hours, almost always depict November or December with the killing of the pig and the preparation of its meat. Salted, smoked, or made into puddings, nothing wasted. In spring came a second plowing and the sowing of the spring crops, barley, oats, beans, and peas, along with lambing and calving, which could pull family members out into cold nights. And then came summer, building toward the two great crescendos of the agricultural year, haymaking in June and July, and the grain harvest in August and September. Harvest was the moment the entire year had been aiming at, and the entire village bent to it. Men mowed with scythes or cut grain with sickles. Women and children bound the sheaves and stacked them. Gleaners followed to gather every fallen ear, a right the poorest villagers guarded jealously, and one the village regulated through its own bylaws, which survive in manorial records. Days during harvest stretched from first light to last, and lords' account rolls show extra ale and food provided to harvest workers because everyone understood a simple truth. The weeks of harvest determined whether the village would eat for the next 12 months. A ruined harvest was not an inconvenience. In the terrible years of 1315 to 1317, when relentless rain destroyed harvests across northern Europe, the resulting Great Famine killed a significant share of the population. Estimates for the worst affected regions run to 10% or more. Every villager lived with that knowledge. If this picture of a life ruled by the seasons is starting to change how you imagine the Middle Ages, this is a good moment to subscribe to Every Life Explained, because there is much more of this day still ahead of us, including what women's work involved, what people ate at midday, and why villagers actually had more holidays than you might expect. Because so far we have mostly followed the plow, and that is only half the village. The working day of women was, if anything, more varied than that of men, and historians who have studied coroners' records, documents describing accidental deaths, which incidentally reveal where people were and what they were doing, have mapped this division of labor in remarkable detail. Barbara Hannawalt's study of these records showed men dying most often in fields, forests, and roads, and women most often in and around the home and its yard, because that is where their work concentrated. But home did not mean idle, and it did not mean indoors. A village wife's domain included the toft, the yard, and garden plot around the house, and this small territory was an engine of survival. Here she grew the vegetables that filled the family pot: cabbages, leeks, onions, garlic, and herbs for cooking and medicine. She kept the hens and geese and often managed the pig. She milked the cow or the sheep and turned the milk into butter and cheese, which could be sold. She brewed ale, and this deserves emphasis. In the 13th and 14th centuries, brewing was largely women's work, done at home in batches, and court records show that in many villages, a large share of households were fined at some point under the assize of ale, the regulations governing ale sales, which tells us these women, known as alewives, were brewing commercially, not just for the family table. Ale mattered because it was not a luxury. Weak ale was the everyday drink of every member of the family, children included, consumed in quantities that startle modern readers. Records of allowances for workers and monks commonly assume a gallon a day. Add to this the endless textile work. Spinning wool into thread with a drop spindle was the universal background task of women's lives, done while watching children, while walking, while tending the pot. So universal that the spindle side became a way of describing the female line of a family, and the word spinster entered the language. Water had to be hauled, bread dough prepared, and often carried to the village oven. Laundry taken to the stream, children minded, the sick nursed, and at harvest and haymaking, women joined the field work too, raking hay, binding sheaves, gleaning. The medieval woman's day was a constant weaving together of a dozen occupations. Children entered this working world early. By around age 7, boys were scaring birds from the newly sown fields, herding geese and helping with animals, while girls learned the round of household tasks beside their mothers. By 12 or 14, many young people worked as servants in other households, a normal stage of life historians call life cycle service, earning their keep and learning skills before marriage. At midday came dinner, the main meal, and it was almost always some version of the same thing. Pottage? Pottage was a thick soup or stew kept going in a cauldron over the fire. A base of oats, barley, or beans and peas, thickened over hours, flavored with whatever the garden and the season offered. Onions, leeks, cabbage, herbs, and enriched, when fortune allowed, with a piece of bacon or salted pork. Meat was not an everyday certainty for poorer families, but archaeological evidence from village sites and the records of food allowances suggest ordinary peasants ate more meat, cheese, and eggs than the old stereotype of a starvation diet allows, especially after the Black Death of 1348 to 1350, when labor became scarce, wages rose, and surviving records show workers demanding and receiving better food. The 14th century poet Langland even complained about laborers who turned up their noses at yesterday's vegetables and demanded fresh meat and fish. What the medieval diet truly lacked was not calories in a normal year, but security. Everything depended on the next harvest. Dinner was also a pause in a day that had rhythms modern schedules do not capture. Medieval people did not measure work in hours. They measured it in tasks and in the church's divisions of the day. The canonical hours, marked by the ringing of bells. The bell for sext at midday, the bell for vespers as evening came. The working day was long in summer, but it was porous, broken by meals, by rest in the heat, by conversation. Historians who have tried to estimate annual working time, such as the economist and historian Gregory Clark, and earlier scholars like James Thorold Rogers, have noted that the medieval year was punctuated by an extraordinary number of non-working days. The church calendar mandated rest on Sundays and on dozens of holy days, saints' feasts, the 12 days of Christmas, the week of Easter. Estimates vary, and not every holiday meant total rest. But many historians conclude that medieval villagers may have had more days off across the year than an industrial worker of the 19th century, whose 14-hour factory days ran year-round. The medieval work year was brutal in its peaks, at harvest and haymaking, and surprisingly slack in its valleys. And those holidays were not spent in silence. The village at festival was loud. Church ales, fundraising celebrations where ale brewed for the parish was sold, brought whole communities together. Wakes, weddings, and seasonal festivals like May Day and Midsummer filled the calendar. Villagers played games, some recognizable ancestors of modern sports: wrestling, archery, which English law in the 14th century actively required men to practice. Early forms of football, played between villages with almost no rules, and games of dice and skittles in the churchyard or the alehouse, sometimes to the recorded disapproval of the parish priest. There was one more category of daily work that touched everyone: clothing the family. Almost nothing a villager wore came from a shop. Wool from the family's own sheep, or bought raw at market, was cleaned, carded, spun into thread at home, and then woven, sometimes on a household loom, more often by a village weaver paid in coin or kind. The resulting cloth was cut and sewn into the standard dress of the countryside, which the illustrated manuscripts of the period show with remarkable consistency. For men, a knee-length tunic over hose with a hood and a leather belt carrying a knife and pouch, and for women, a long gown over a linen underdress with the hair covered after marriage. Most people owned very few garments. Wills and manorial records of peasants' goods rarely list more than a change or two of clothing, and garments were patched, altered, and handed down until they wore to rags, and even the rags had value. Shoes of leather, made or repaired by a village cobbler, wore out quickly on mud and stubble, and going barefoot in summer was common for children and for adults at certain kinds of work. Nor was the village a sealed world. On market day, typically once a week in the nearest market town, villagers walked or drove animals along mud roads to sell what they had produced beyond their own needs: eggs, cheese, butter, ale, vegetables, a fattened pig, spun thread, and to buy what the village could not make, above all, salt, essential for preserving meat and fish, along with iron tools, tar, millstones, and occasionally a small luxury like spices or a ribbon. England around 1300 had well over 1,000 chartered markets, and historians of the medieval economy, such as Christopher Dyer, have shown that even quite humble peasant households were regular participants in this cash economy, earning and spending small sums of silver pennies. A market town 5 or 6 miles away meant a round trip of 10 or 12 miles on foot, done in a day, carrying goods. A routine journey that adds yet another kind of labor, walking itself, to the villager's account of hours. Beyond the market lay the wider world of pilgrimage, of church courts, of royal justices on circuit, of news carried by travelers, and the records show villagers moving through all of it more often than the stereotype of the peasant who never left his village would suggest. The afternoon of an ordinary working day continued the morning's labor, but the village was never only its fields. Walk through it in imagination, and you would pass the mill, where villagers were usually required to grind their grain for a fee paid to the lord, a monopoly so resented that manorial court rolls record villagers fined for secretly using hand mills at home. You would pass the smith at his forge, sharpening plow irons. You would see the church, the largest building most villagers would ever regularly enter, its interior painted with scenes of scripture and judgment for a congregation that mostly could not read. The parish priest, himself often only modestly educated and farming his own glebe land, baptized, married, and buried every person in the village. You would also, on certain days, see the village governing itself. The manorial court, held every few weeks in many manors, was where the community's business was done, and its rolls are one of our richest windows into daily life. Here, villagers were fined for letting cattle stray into the wheat, for brewing ale against the assize, for failing to perform their labor services, for brawling, for taking firewood beyond their right. Here land changed hands, marriages were licensed, orphans' guardians were appointed, and the village elected its own officers. The reeve, who organized the manor's agricultural work and was himself a peasant chosen by his neighbors, the hayward, who guarded the crops and hedges, the ale tasters who checked the quality of every brew. Ordinary villagers, men with dirt under their fingernails, ran this system, kept its customs in memory, and argued their rights before the Lord Steward. The records show them doing so constantly and often successfully. These were not passive people. They were negotiators, litigants, and local politicians. A word, too, about the body itself, because staying clean and staying healthy were daily concerns, not modern inventions. The old claim that medieval people never washed is not supported by the evidence. Full immersion baths were rare in a peasant household. Heating that much water over an open fire was a serious expense of fuel and labor. But daily washing of hands and face was expected. Hand washing before meals was standard courtesy noted in the conduct literature of the age, and streams and rivers served for bathing in warm weather. Teeth were cleaned by rubbing with cloths and chewing herbs. What villagers could not control was the water they drank and the parasites they lived with, and this is one reason ale was so central. Brewing involved boiling, which made ale genuinely safer than water from a well shared with the farmyard, even if no one at the time could have explained why. Sickness, when it came, was met with herbal remedies grown in the garden, and knowledge passed between women, with prayer and pilgrimage, and, for the fortunate, with the advice of a monastic infirmary. Physicians were for the rich, and no honest account of the medieval village can end without acknowledging the event that cut through every routine described here. Between 1348 and 1350, the Black Death killed, by most scholarly estimates, somewhere between a third and a half of England's population, and comparable shares across much of Europe. Entire villages were left half empty, and some were abandoned forever. Archaeologists have identified thousands of deserted medieval village sites across England. Yet what is remarkable in the records is what happened to the survivors' daily lives. With labor suddenly scarce, wages rose sharply despite royal laws like the 1351 Statute of Laborers that tried to freeze them. Villeins bargained their way out of labor services, converting them to money rents. Diets improved, land became cheaper to hold, and the long, slow dissolution of serfdom in England accelerated. The very structure of the working day we have been following, the days owed to the Lord, the boon works at harvest, began, within a generation or two, to loosen and fall away. The ordinary villagers of the later 14th and 15th centuries measured out days that their great-grandparents would have recognized in shape, but that belonged, increasingly, to themselves. As the light began to fail, the day folded back toward the house. Animals were brought in and secured. A lighter supper was eaten. Bread, cheese, the remains of the pottage, ale. And then came the hours historians once overlooked, the evening. Fuel and light were too costly to waste, but the fire was there, and around it the household finished the quiet tasks, the wife spinning, the husband mending a harness or carving a tool handle, children shelling beans, neighbors visited. This was the hour of talk, of stories, of songs, of the shared memory that carried village customs from one generation to the next, in a world where almost nothing was written down for them. Sleep came early by our standards, on straw mattresses or sacks laid on frames or on the floor, the whole family often sharing the warmest spot near the banked fire, under wool blankets and their own daytime clothes in winter. Some historians, most notably Roger Ekirch, have argued from later evidence that pre-industrial people commonly slept in two segments, waking in the middle of the night for an hour of quiet, prayer, or conversation before a second sleep. A pattern that, if it held in the medieval village, would make even the night itself structured in a way we have forgotten. The evidence for the medieval period specifically is debated, and it is honest to say historians are not certain. What is certain is that when the fire was covered and the door barred, the village lay in a darkness deeper than almost any place a modern person has experienced, waiting for the rooster. So what did medieval villagers actually do all day? They plowed, sowed, harvested, threshed, herded, brewed, spun, baked, built, repaired, judged, celebrated, prayed, and talked. Their day was longer than ours in summer and shorter in winter, harder in its physical demands and looser in its schedule, poorer in comfort and richer in community than the cartoon version of the Middle Ages suggests. Their labor was heavy. Skeletal remains from medieval cemeteries show the marks of it. Worn joints and strained spines, and life expectancy at birth, dragged down by high infant mortality, sat in the low 30s, though a villager who survived childhood could reasonably hope to see 50 or 60. They accepted risks and losses as normal that we would find unbearable. And yet, the records they left behind, the court rolls, the bylaws, the fines, the festivals, show communities that were organized, resilient, argumentative, and alive. Perhaps that is the real answer hiding inside the question. The medieval villager's day was not empty toil. It was a complete world, built by ordinary people who understood their land, their neighbors, their obligations, and their rights, and who passed that understanding down for centuries without ever writing most of it down. Nearly everything about their material life has vanished, but the shape of their days, the cooperation, the seasonal rhythm, the evening by the fire, is the foundation the modern world was built on, and only very recently left behind. If this journey into an ordinary day 7 centuries ago changed the way you picture the past, subscribe to Every Life Explained. Because history is not only made of kings and battles, it is made of mornings like that one in a small house before sunrise, when a family woke in the dark and began, once again, the work of staying alive. And there are so many more of those mornings left to explain.